I'll be ready whenever he's ready.
Hey, I'm Patrick McLaughlin.
Hi, Dick Pierce.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
How are you, sir?
Hi,
Tom Price.
Dick Pierce. Nice to meet you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
How you doing? Great to see you, Patrick McLaughlin. Thanks for being with us. Pleasure. Appreciate it. We got one who's AWOL for a minute, I understand. Yeah, good. Well, thank you for your
So
input.
you already went to the Trump session?
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going anywhere near that.
They're
but,
all over there. It's a media cluster.
And you're not tempted to drop by the Comey hearings and see what's
Yeah, we're
happening?
kind of
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, I think there should be more press attention to the Comey hearings than
Well, I suspect budget process reform never gets the top of the banner anyway.
People are tempted to go after Comey post.
Yeah.
Tough as nails.
Well, he demonstrated 2 days ago that he wasn't as tough as nails. So.
He has every Democrat. Did you read the Post this week?
No.
There's an op-ed from a Democrat talking about how totally inappropriate that is. So, I mean,
Because?
he's displeased everyone, and that's a trademark of Jim Crow, because he went through this elaborate explanation of why we've done. That has not pleased people in the other, so everybody's tempted to go after him. I mean,
I don't think that we'll go after him. I think we will express our remarkable disappointment in removing the blindfold from the Lady of Justice.
well, and how about also capitalizing on that thing? I assume that the Trump campaign, if they ever get somebody who knows what they're doing on board,
Oh, yeah.
will be using a lot of clips.
Yeah. How are you? Great to see you, Wayne. Thanks so much. We appreciate you being here. Yeah. We got a little competition this morning, as you know, so we'll see if anybody shows. But I'm here and Mr. Yarmouth's here, so we may have a family discussion.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Turn this around so that it faces the other way after all these renovations.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Facing out this way.
Oh, they're on? Okay. Thank you.
This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everybody to the budget hearing, where we're going to focus on regulatory budgeting. As folks know, we have a bit of competition this morning in a number of different areas, but I'm certain that members will show as their schedule allows. Yesterday's hearing we had here in this room focused on a series of different potential alternative budgeting methodologies. Performance budgeting and zero-based budgeting and portfolio budgeting and the like. Today we're focusing on a specific area of interest, and that is regulatory budgeting. This is an area apart from the different styles of budgeting that would directly affect how this committee would allocate discretionary and mandatory spending. However, there's a direct connection between the financial impact of regulations on our economy, on American innovators, on individuals, on families, and our nation's fiscal well-being. So it's appropriate and fitting that we, in the context of an overhaul of the congressional budget process, highlight and discuss regulatory budgeting. At nearly $2 trillion, the compliance costs of the regulatory burden on the country, that amount is 6 to 7 times larger than the annual corporate federal income tax burden that's collected. It's roughly equivalent to half of what the federal government spent last year in its entirety. If the annual cost of the regulatory state in America was represented by an independent country's economy, it would qualify as one of the world's top 10 economies, ranking between India and Russia. This is money that's removed from the productive economy. How has this happened? For too long, Congress as an institution has ceded greater and greater authority to a regulatory state that has grown in power to become, in many ways, an uncharted fourth branch of government. Not surprisingly, the executive branch, through both Republican and Democratic administrations, has welcomed the opportunity to impose its will on the American people through a cadre of unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats. Without conceding that this arrangement is acceptable, and it is not from our perspective, we should still be willing to consider the establishment of a budget that accounts for the impact of the regulatory state. A regulatory budget would serve several purposes, not the least of which is a transparent accounting of the true impact of actions taken by the executive branch of the government. As we've discussed numerous times in this committee, a budget is not simply a set of numbers. It identifies and signifies priorities. Similarly, a regulatory budget would not simply be an accounting of the financial consequences of a given regulation. It would be a window into the impact of that regulation on the broader economy, on the lives and the livelihoods of the American people. It would present the American people in Congress, which is charged with oversight of all government activity, facts that would be supremely important to conduct that oversight. The volume of regulations has increased significantly, again, through Republican and Democratic administrations. Recently, however, there's been a markedly overshadowing of the number of laws that have been passed by regulations. Just last year, there were 115 laws passed by Congress and enacted into law total. At the same time, there were 3,410 new rules issued by federal agencies. So who's most harmed by the ever-expanding regulatory state and the costs associated with it? It's not predominantly the big banks or corporations that are often the target of choice for regulators and those backing their regulations. In fact, it's small businesses who do not have the army of lawyers that large business have to help comply with or weather the fallout. It's low-income individuals and households who see the price of goods and services like housing and electricity and transportation go up because of the heavy regulatory burden in those industries. That's who's getting squeezed, low-income Americans and small business. Remember that nearly $2 trillion spent each year by those trying to be certain that they're complying with all of these regulations. And those costs of necessity are passed on. They're passed on to everyone, and the folks most harmed by these compliance costs are those least able to pay. Despite all of this, Congress has no systematic means of tracking and, if possible, restraining this expansion of the regulatory state. The budget resolution passed out of this committee earlier this year specifically discussed the need for regulatory budgeting. It was the first time that a budget resolution expressly called for such a budget, and we're not alone in this effort. The Speaker of the House's task force on reducing regulatory burdens also specifically recommended establishing a regulatory budget to help address the growing concern of the regulatory state. So we're grateful today for the participation of our panel. We have Dr. Patrick McLaughlin, who's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, Richard Pierce, who's the Lyle Alverson Professor of Law at George Washington University, and Clyde Wayne Cruz, Vice President for Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I want to thank you all for being here. We look forward to your testimony and to a discussion that will follow. And I'm pleased to yield for an opening statement to the ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for joining us. This is the 7th and final hearing in this series on budget process reform, and I commend the chairman for his dedication to this issue. That said, as I've said at each of these meetings, the root of our inability to pass a budget agreement is not primarily a flawed process, it's the lack of political will. In this current Congress, it's a refusal by Republican leadership to take on the extreme wing of their conference or to counter that extremism by compromising with Democrats on a bipartisan budget agreement as we did last fall. I don't expect that to change this Congress, and I'm sure the chairman doesn't either, which is why he has turned the focus of this committee to budget process reform. We've heard a lot from a lot of witnesses, and we've considered a lot of different ideas for reform. There are parts of some plans that could be helpful and parts of some plans that could be dangerously harmful. But collectively, it remains to be seen whether any of these reform proposals can be effectively implemented at the federal level. I understand the chairman will have a plan to do just that, and the majority will release budget process reform recommendations sometime this fall. We as Democrats look forward to reviewing those recommendations and discussing whether or not they will benefit the budget process and ultimately the people we represent. With regard to this specific hearing, I'm really intrigued by the concept. I wrote an op-ed published nationally several months ago talking about our responsibility as Democrats who believe in both regulation and a vibrant government to make sure that what government does is effective and makes sense. And I think we actually have as the party of government, quote unquote, we have a bigger responsibility than Republicans to make sure that the regulations we impose upon the American public are the kind that will truly provide a public benefit and not just jobs for bureaucrats. But that being said, there is a concern that I think most Democrats share that a regulatory budget proposal might be just a guise for cutting back on regulations, whether they make sense or not. So we'll look forward to that discussion. And Mr. Chairman, once again, I commend you on calling this hearing, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I want to assure him and others that our goal is to have this conversation and this process be one of comedy and collegiality. I think that the gentleman identified areas where I think there is common concern about the size of the bureaucracy and whether or not it's actually accomplishing its goals. So we appreciate that and look forward to working together. Dr. McLaughlin, Mr. Pearson, Mr. Cruz, we want to thank you again for your time today. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal record hearing. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and Dr. McLaughlin, you may begin when ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Price, Ranking Member Yarmouth, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me. My testimony contains two main themes. First, the regulatory process is not perfect. It doesn't take an expert to deliver that news. Errors do occur. A regulatory budget could reduce the error rate, as well as identify rules that have become obsolete. Second, I'll discuss some of the mechanics of the regulatory budget, some of the nuts and bolts, so to speak. Regulatory budgeting is a bipartisan concept. When the Budget Act of 1974 was passed, work on a parallel system for the budgeting of regulatory costs was already underway, led by Senator Lloyd Benson and supported by many in the Carter administration. In fact, regulatory reform itself has a bipartisan history. Every president of the past 4 decades, regardless of party, has recognized that federal regulations are unnecessarily lengthy and complex. Recent advances in economics offer more specific evidence as to why these presidents found the pruning of regulations a worthy idea to consider, if not implement. Regulatory accumulation, that is, the buildup of rules over time, has been demonstrated to distort business investment choices, deter innovation, hinder productivity growth, and slow economic growth. The degree to which regulatory accumulation can directly harm low-income households is even more troubling. These negative effects might be acceptable if we were confident that every regulation was effective and efficient, delivering the outcomes intended by Congress's authorizing statutes at a reasonable cost. But the regulatory process, as mentioned earlier, is subject to error, and importantly, there is no formal mechanism or systematic procedure for the identification and correction of errors. Regulatory budgeting introduces dynamic elements into the regulatory process that would provide agencies greater incentive to identify and correct any existing errors and avoid them going forward. Currently, an agency's objective without a regulatory budget is to promulgate rules related to its mission. With a few exceptions, the effectiveness and efficiency of those rules are not evaluated in hindsight, and relatively few new rules are systematically analyzed beforehand. An agency with a regulatory budget would act differently. First, it would prioritize those regulations that most effectively and efficiently fulfill the agency's mission. And second, the agency would have incentive to identify, modify, or eliminate old regulations that are ineffective or intolerably inefficient. Regarding the mechanics of a regulatory budget, I'd like to highlight just 2 points and refer you to my testimony for others, my written testimony for others. First is on the question of how is the limit determined and applied. There are 2 approaches to consider. an agency-centric approach and a legislation-centric approach. Agency-centric methods focus on the actions of the agencies themselves as if they are independent entities. Congress would set regulatory budgets for agencies during the budgeting process, depending on Congress's perception of needs, effectiveness, importance, or other factors, either following a predetermined rule or with some flexibility. The regulatory budget would then exist as a cost ledger parallel to the fiscal budget. A legislation-centric approach would focus on congressional bills before their passage, recognizing that authorizing statutes are the wellspring of all regulation. A bill would be scored by an independent body, perhaps an office of the CBO or a similar entity, to estimate the bill's anticipated regulatory costs. Upon the passage of the bill, these anticipated costs would be allocated to the agencies mandated to create new regulations under the new legislation. This approach effectively treats regulations as joint products of Congress and agencies. Another important question is who does the measuring? Several studies warn of the conflict of interest that arises when regulatory analysis is performed by an entity that has incentive to create a regulation. The same logic applies in the case of regulatory budgeting. The estimation of the effects of regulations can turn into an exercise in advocacy if there's a conflict of interest. Two different approaches have been used to overcome similar potential conflicts of interest. The first is to assign the task of analysis to a body that has no interest, political, financial, or budgetary, in seeing a regulation pass or fail. The second is to create a process for oversight and quality control, perhaps something like the peer review process that's used in scientific publication. This could be aided by the specification of a transparent and replicable methodology that the analyses must follow. To wrap up, regulations are perhaps unique in the sense that they are undeniably important to all actions in the economy, but are not subject to a process for error correction. These errors, most of which are probably undiagnosed, owing to the lack of retrospective analysis, are far from benign. They contribute to regulatory accumulation, a force that disproportionately harms low-income households, deters innovation, and slows economic growth without delivering offsetting benefits. A better process would spur the development and application of high-quality information, both before and after the effects of regulations have been observed, and regulatory budgeting represents one option to achieve just that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pierce, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Price, Ranking Member Yarborough, and distinguished members of the House Committee on the Budget for the opportunity to testify before you today. I've long supported a regulatory budget as long as it is well-designed and well-implemented. The United States has had a well-designed, well-implemented regulatory budget for at least 25 years now. It was begun initially with the issuance of Executive Order 12,291 by President Ronald Reagan. That executive order requires the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the Office of Management and Budget to conduct a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether any major rule that any executive branch agency wishes to issue would produce benefits that exceed its costs. Every president since President Reagan has issued a similar executive order. That is the starting point and the principal foundation for the excellent regulatory budget that we have long had. That has been supplemented more recently by Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama, each of whom have issued executive orders that require every agency, every executive branch agency to review every existing rule and to identify those rules that impose costs that exceed their benefits and to begin the process of rescinding or amending any rule that produces costs that exceed its benefits, except where a statute, of course, prohibits an agency from taking that action. There are also forms of regulatory budgets that would be extraordinarily destructive. These are forms of regulatory budgets that focus exclusively on the costs of regulation and ignore the benefits of regulation. To illustrate the destructive effect that such a type of regulatory budget would have, I will refer to the report of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs that found that between October 1, 2003 and September 30, 2013, that 10-year period, OIRA estimated that the costs of the rules issued by the Bush administration and the Obama administration were between 57 and $84 billion. Those sound like really high costs until you compare them with the estimated aggregate benefits of those rules of between $217 billion and $863 billion. The net benefit of the rules that were issued by the Bush and Obama administrations over that 10-year period was between $133 and $806 billion. Many thousands of Americans are alive and well today only because agencies in the Bush and Obama administration issued those rules. If during the period 2003 to 2013, the United States had had a regulatory budget that looks only at the costs of regulation and ignores the benefits of regulation, there would be thousands of Americans today who would be dead, maimed, or seriously ill. So I'm in favor of, strongly supportive of a continuation of the kind of excellent, well-designed, and well-implemented regulatory budget we have had ever since it was created by President Ronald Reagan. I am strongly opposed to any form of regulatory budget that would look only at the costs of regulation and would ignore the benefits of regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cruz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I'm Wayne Cruz, Vice President for Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a libertarian public policy and advocacy group, and I thank the committee for the invitation to address regulatory budgeting. The federal government doesn't merely spend nearly $4 trillion a year. It redirects private sector to spend colossal sums and otherwise repurposes vast resources. Accordingly, the concept of a regulatory budget sometimes gains currency, such as the 2017 Budget Resolution's policy statement on federal regulatory budgeting. That regulatory cost rival a sizable percentage of the level of government spending itself, argues for bipartisan scorekeeping. But here's the thing. Nobody sees the same rainbow. You can look that up. And nobody necessarily sees the same costs and benefits of any given regulation. So let us commence the case for regulatory budgeting by recognizing that, some compliance cost burdens aside, perfectly tabulating subjective and indirect costs is impossible. That said, try we must. Even if Washington collected a tiny percentage of Americans' incomes in taxes, we would still monitor taxation to prevent its abuse. Current disclosure is worrisome. Members may have noticed the 2016 OMB report to Congress on the costs and benefits of regulation is still overdue, putting us almost 2 years behind on regulatory cost-benefit data. Moreover, we should pay attention to the unmeasured categories of intervention as cost drivers as well, such as antitrust, the locking up of Western lands for resource use, the reluctance since the 1980s to move spectrum and other commons into the wealth-creating sector, and more. When government steers in some area of practical endeavor, it creates costs even if no future rules are issued, such as the federal government's recent delivery of the internet and, as of 2 weeks ago, drones into century-old public utility models. Furthermore, the proliferation of agency guidance, or what I've taken to calling regulatory dark matter, will complicate budgeting efforts. We confront this, though, in an environment in which cost-benefit analysis is largely absent. The latest ever, last year, 2015 OMB report showed just 13 rules out of thousands with reviewed cost-benefit analysis, and independent agencies and guidance get a pass. The concept of regulatory budgeting is not new nor partisan. Democratic Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who served as Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration, proposed back in the 1979 DISCO era an annual cap on compliance costs that each agency could impose on the private sector, plus coordinating the regulatory and fiscal budgets. That's important when considering dynamic scoring and recognizing regulation's effect on macroeconomic variables. Regulatory budgeting was also considered in President Jimmy Carter's 1980 Economic Report of the President. Recent offerings include Senator Marco Rubio's National Regulatory Budget and Senator Mike Lee and Representative Mark Walker's Article I Regulatory Budget Act. Also in June, the House Task Force on the Economy suggested a regulatory budget. A comprehensive budget paralleling the fiscal one would presumably require Congress to divide a total among agencies roughly in proportion to potential lives saved or some other key metrics. Agencies would rank concerns address them within their budget constraint. While agencies could regulate unwisely, they risk squandering their squandered budget allocation to shift to a rival agency that saves more lives or performs some other tasks better. However, regulatory budgeting brings potential pitfalls and enforcement difficulties that I discuss in my written testimony. Ways to promote success include initiating an incremental rather than total budget and building from there. Establishing a cost freeze, a one-in, one-out approach like Senator Mark Warner talked about, is the simplest regulatory budget as it happens. Implementing the Bipartisan Regulatory Improvement Commission could help reduce the universe of matter that you have to deal with as you consider regulatory budgeting. I highlight in my testimony also the former regulatory program of the U.S. government, a model by which OMB could compile an annual regulatory transparency report with pre-budgetary matter, paralleling the historical tables in the fiscal budget. You could also employ separate budgets for economic, social, health and safety, and paperwork costs. So, cautious regulatory budgeting deserves consideration as Congress assumes greater accountability, and it is my hope reverses the overdelegation acknowledged in the recent Article I Task Force report. Like taxes, regulations transfer wealth from one party to another. So we could do far worse than cautious regulatory budget experiments within a broader framework of congressional accountability for agencies' regulations and guidance. In fact, that's what we do, far worse. Thank you very much.
I thank you all for your testimony. I think there is universal consensus that regulatory budgeting is important. There's a difference. Mr. Pierce thinks what we're doing right now appears to be just fine, and obviously a couple of the others, you, Dr. McLaughlin and Mr. Cruz, think we may be able to improve on that. Dr. McLaughlin, let me start with you, if I may. I was interested in your agency-centric or legislative-centric application for a regulatory budget. Regardless, when people hear regulatory budget, they hear different things. They hear either administrative costs or compliance costs or the economic costs to society itself. And I'm intrigued by the legislation-centric. If we were to go in that direction, how would we, in that area, how do we define it? Or in any area, how would you define it in terms of what we're measuring as the costs?
There's obviously a lot of different approaches. I think one that makes a lot of sense as an economist is to consider economic costs, the social costs, whether you're considering that from the agency-centric approach or the legislative-centric approach. In either case, number one, I think the method with which costs are estimated, economic costs are estimated, needs to be transparent and replicable. It's always going to be an estimation exercise. There's always going to be iterative improvements that can be made. The important part is that we are doing something in a consistent way, and that way budgeting can be consistent over time. Now let me just add, economic costs, importantly, are not just costs that are imposed upon businesses, compliance costs. These are costs to society at large, things like the effects on low-income households. If we want to put some cost on that, some value to that, we can consider that. The deterred innovation that regulations can lead to, that can also be considered. But again, just to wrap up, I don't want to take much of your time. I think the most important point here is whatever the method, it needs to be transparent and replicable and something that can be built upon over time.
Help me understand how the models are currently for measuring these economic costs. Is there consensus in the economic world about what those models look like or what they ought to look like, and how effective are they at estimating or predicting what the regulatory burden costs on the economy would be?
I'd say the science of understanding regulatory costs is developing relative to what we've seen in taxation, that sort of the effects of taxation on the economy, but it's following a similar logic. And I think we can learn a little bit by thinking about dynamic scoring and the logic there. The way the models have been developing now is to consider how individuals and businesses in the economy are affected in terms of their incentives and their actions when regulations are created. It's not just the compliance costs, it's what choices do they make going forward, and how does that affect long-run economic growth. This goes back directly to the point about innovation. If people don't have as much incentive to make investments in R&D, you might get deterred innovation.
Is there consensus on that? Economic consensus?
I don't think that we've actually had a large enough debate on it to say whether there's consensus or not.
Mr. Cruz, let me pick up on that. Is there consensus on what the definition let's stick to the economic costs of regulation?
Well, I don't think so. You can find in earlier budget reports and congressional reports, principles for creating regulatory impact analyses for what agencies do and things of that sort. And there are guidances there. And, there are principles we have in place for considering what's an economically significant regulation, for example. And even with respect to guidance that's potentially economically significant, so there's a voluntary effort by agencies to expose that. But, the debate is always the same. It's always, well, agencies have an incentive to understate cost, and the business folks have an incentive to overstate costs. So I think you start with the easiest things first. You can look at paperwork burdens, and you can kind of know what compliance costs are, what the labor pay scales are for people who are having to fill out paperwork, how many more hires they're having to do because of Dodd-Frank or Obamacare or so on down the line. But economic costs are always going to be easier than your health and safety costs that we deal with. And Dr. Pierce talked about the notion of benefits. I think the benefits are extremely important when you're talking about regulation. I do think the budget needs to be a cost one, but I think you need to deal with benefits in other ways that are just as important. But the easiest stuff is your paperwork cost, then your gross compliance costs, like who you have to hire to deal with federal regulatory agencies and such. But then you also have to think about, as Patrick said, the investment. When the federal government decides to regulate net neutrality, say, or when it puts out a 500-page regulation, as it did 2 weeks ago, on regulating drones and keeping the entire old air traffic control system that we've got in place and a brand new technology, very difficult to start to measure those kinds of costs, but you can make estimates, and as Patrick said, and I think we'll have to do this no matter what. No matter what cost mechanism we use, you're going to have to revisit it and rethink it over time and go back and try to converge and get it something.
The number that I have seen out there in the economic literature is that the compliance costs in the private economy for the regulatory burden across the board on our country is about $1.8 trillion. Is that an accurate number?
That's one, there are a lot of estimates, and at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, I do a compilation looking at what OMB has said over the last 10 years, what it had said at the turn of the century, what GAO had said, what compliance costs from the paperwork is from the information collection budget, which does exist. That's late. And I come up with a 1.89 estimate. But there are other estimates that are higher out there. There's one at the extreme that says if we had frozen regulations many years back, the economy could be in 50 trillion instead of the 18 trillion it is now. I don't know how you answer that question perfectly, but I think the 1.9 is something I can't go below,
right.
But I think that there are a lot of things that are left out. We leave out the costs of independent agencies. We leave out a lot of the cost of diverted resources, as we do with something like net neutrality. Job costs are typically left out. There are a lot of energy efficiency standards that are against what the public would do, and what business people I've talked to said they're trying to do the wrong thing. You save more energy just with solid state controls that cut things off. I mean, there are a lot of things that we do. We regulate poorly, and there are just so many categories of regulatory costs that we don't count.
Let me pick up there and touch on oftentimes when we talk about regulatory budgeting, we talk about going forward, from here forward. One of the concerns that many of us have is all the regulations that are on the books right now, and you alluded to that. Right. If you look at the history, and even though we may not have measured what's happening out there because of those regulations, but how would you suggest that we begin? How would we start to evaluate those as the legislative branch start to evaluate those regulations and bring them under the spotlight and reform those.
What I would do, OMB that puts out the annual report to Congress on benefits and cost regulation was extremely valuable. I just wish it was more inclusive of all of the regulations that are coming out. But I think it's a terrific doc. I'm a huge OIRA OMB fan. OMB used to take a look at aggregate costs of regulation. It doesn't do that anymore. It just looks at the last 10 years, and there are arguments for and against that, and I understand both of them. I'm on the side of OMB being a little more aggressive and saying, well, we need to take a look at what energy regulations are doing and what financial regulations are doing, what job costs are or dislocation costs are might be. So I think you break things up that way. You let OMB get more aggressive in terms of what it measures. You do a prospective basis budgeting, like as Patrick said, either legislatively or through the regulatory side. You want to kind of put a number on what you think you're willing to spend. I mean, we know what health and safety risks are. We know what the economic concerns are. It used to be that we had said, federal government running telecommunications and transportation was a bad idea, so we wanted to reduce economic regulations. But in recent years, those have started going up again in FCC, independent agency regulations and such. But you all, on a bipartisan basis, I think, can get together and talk about when economic regulations might make less sense. It might be a bad idea to regulate drones a certain way, or driverless vehicles a certain way, or 3D printing a certain way, or privacy and so forth. But look at what you can cut in economic regulations, have OMB start again to do aggregate estimates of regulatory costs, and that's not just the yearly. Make sure the information collection budget on paperwork costs comes out on a timely basis, and start putting the pieces together. For the existing burden, I'd mentioned in my testimony, you have the tool of I used to work in the Senate, and Senator Phil Gramm back in the 90s had proposed a regulatory reduction commission, and now there's a regulatory improvement commission in the Congress that's a bipartisan effort. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think you all could get together and think about, well, let's put together a bipartisan package on what rules we think make less sense, where we can cut paperwork and reduce burdens and things like that. So you have a long-term goal for what you want the cost budget to do, but you start going at pieces of it like that.
Great. No, I appreciate that perspective. We may get to a second round depending on who shows up. I thank you for your responses. Mr. Yarmouth, you're recognized for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to respond to your comment about these hearings being held with comedy and dignity. I think they absolutely have been, and our hearing yesterday was, I thought, very constructive and intelligent. I think the discussion today is also. So I appreciate the tone that you have set. I sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee as well as this committee, so I see regulation from two very different perspectives. Yeah. Here, we're talking about the cost of the agency, basically the on-books impact from the taxpayer standpoint, cost and revenue. And on the Energy and Commerce Committee, we're talking a lot more about these non-budget results or implications. The benefits and so forth. And we've had a series of hearings and debated a bunch of legislation over the last year and a half regarding the Clean Power Plan from the administration. And I can't help but thinking about individual situations when I listen to the witnesses' testimony. And it seems to me that some of these things would be incredibly difficult to do in a structured process. First of all, I don't think that we want to get into a debate on climate change as part of the budgetary process, because ultimately that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with, if you're trying to project potential long-term benefits of environmental regulations, you could talk about the benefit of saving South Florida from being flooded. And you could go into a whole series of arguments about that. So I have a hard time figuring out how that can be structured. Then I think about something like menu labeling and the dietary benefits, the dietary impact of food and so forth. And all the studies that have been done would show that people basically don't pay much attention to them. And there you have a little bit different consequence, because you have to try to estimate whether there was any avoidance of obesity and therefore healthcare costs and then impact back on the federal budget and state budgets. So I guess all that's by way of leading to a question is that it's so many of these, and all of you seem to agree that we need to consider benefits as part of any regulatory budget process. How do you deal with these benefits which are intangible, which so many of which are costs avoided and not necessarily tax dollars returned to the budget, but social costs, human costs avoided? How do you accommodate that in any kind of a budgetary process? You all can take a shot at it.
Well, I think it's a very important question. I also agree with Mr. Cruz that we should focus on costs, mostly because of the simplicity of doing that. It is complicated in and of itself, and adding benefits is also another complication. It's a very good point. But take a note from the fiscal budgeting process that already exists. When spending is considered, when outlays are considered, those are the numbers. The dollars that are going out are the numbers that are on the budget. But it's not that you don't consider what the benefits of those are. That's just not formalized. And so the allocation of budgets to different areas, different programs, or different regulations in this case implicitly considers the benefits. You can consider the best science that's available on the topic in the budgeting process without having a formal ledger for them.
Well, I guess the question I would ask is, that's the type of analysis we go through in the Energy and Commerce Committee when we're debating whether we should make changes in the Clean Power Plan, or we should essentially repeal it or whatever. And that I don't quite understand how that kind of consideration, which is clearly the normal business of the committees of jurisdiction that we have here, how that interacts with our committee and the strict budget writing process that we go through, which is basically, again, that's all on the taxpayers' books, where most of the discussion we're having about regulation is non-governmental, the expenses that are placed on the private system, the private sector, and the benefits which accrue largely outside the government.
Like Mr. Cruz, I'm a real fan of OMB and OIRA. I think they do a really good job. And they're constantly grappling with these questions. I mean, this is a process of estimation. You're not going to get precision. You're going to get the best estimates you can get. I think we get the best estimates you can get from OMB and OIRA today. There's a debate. There's a general agreement, I think, among economists on the virtues of cost-benefit analysis and the general contours of a good cost-benefit analysis. Where people debate all the time is in the details of implementation. And that's where OIRA and OMB are just, they do their best to stay on top of that literature, and they're constantly making adjustments in their methodologies to come up with the best estimates they can of costs and benefits. I don't know of a way of improving on that.
Sometimes you also have to think about the costs of benefits too, in a sense that when we say regulation, it's not always that the top-down regulation is the best way to go. And I think everybody sees that in a lot of ways. You can do a lot better than meat that's tainted, often is USDA approved, and you always want to try to escalate. Think of food safety, privacy, cybersecurity, financial stability. All of those values that we want are also forms of wealth too. Energy security is one also. And you need markets to escalate those, not just the central regulatory process to do that. And sometimes regulations can do good things, sometimes they can do bad things. I used to work in the FDA, and this was back during the original food labeling. You mentioned the menu labeling. And one of the things, and I wrote the regulatory impact analysis within arguing against the prohibition of health claims, because if you tell a manufacturer, well, you cannot make health claims, they're going to advertise taste, convenience, microwavability, portability, and all these things, and you can actually have the average health quality of new foods introduced go down. So the regulation does a bad thing; it creates a negative rather than a benefit. But there are differences. You know, sometimes when you're talking about a public health issue, a Zika issue, or something like that, the benefit question is much more significant. I think what the regulatory budgeting notion on a bipartisan basis would get you to think about is if that Southern Florida issue is the key one that is of concern to most of you, that's where you say the regulatory compliance cost or the economic indirect cost can fall in the future.
Yeah, well,
And,
I think in a broader sense, if you talk about the function of government to begin with, it kind of, to me, argues against cost-benefit analysis anyway. Because, you know, the Lincoln-esque definition of government is that does for the people what they cannot do as well for themselves. And if you broaden the activity of government to include national security, TSA, you can talk about all the costs about TSA and FAA regulations on aircraft, and the benefit is ultimately that no plane crashes because of a terrorist bomb. And so the cost benefit there is probably overwhelmingly cost heavy, because you can't, there is no benefit that we know except the fact we haven't had any explosions in the air. So that's where I get to try to quantify the societal benefit of a lot of these regulations seems to me to be a very difficult task.
But I wouldn't lose hope because I don't think you always have to. And you want to do it in terms of where you're allocating the compliance cost for the regulatory enterprise. But remember, you all are the Congress and you all are overseeing what the agencies do. And when there's a special case like that, you can say cost be damned, and you're gonna whether the agency acts or not, you could pass a law to make it happen.
Right. And I agree, as I said in my introductory remarks, I strongly believe that we need to do a much greater job and a much better job in providing oversight for the rules that are on the books. I'm on the telecom subcommittee on energy and commerce. We have laws still in effect and regulations that were part of the original 1934 Act, which, you know, I think we ought to repeal every communications law that was put on the books before 1995, because it basically is irrelevant. And that's another question which we can get into, the whole question of the pace of change and whether regulations in today's world can ever keep up with the way the world is changing. But anyway, I'll stop with that, and thank you once again for your responses, and look forward to further discussion. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Cruz, I'd like to start with you. Is there an existing entity, whether it be CBO, GAO, OMB, or others, that you would task with establishing a regulatory baseline and conducting retrospective reviews?
Right now, I would start with OMB because that's where most of the activity is. And if you look at the new Article 1 Regulatory Budget Act, what that calls for, it eases into a regulatory budget. It doesn't. I think there are you can run into a lot of difficulties, as we've discussed already, about trying to go in too quickly and set a comprehensive overall budget for the entire U.S. economy. But that eases in by just having the president put a regulatory cost budget number in his budget proposal, and then have the budget committees discuss it with authorizing committees and so forth. But then down the road, it becomes a CBO estimate, becomes something more like an enforceable regulatory budget. It used to be the case that OMB put out a more comprehensive aggregate regulatory cost estimate. They could do that again. They would commission. I would recommend they get several different scholars to look at it, using different models to come up with some kind of a range. And that's what they had done in the past. But now what OMB does, if you look at the OMB cost benefit reports, is they just do a 10-year look back, which is very, very useful. But it's not the aggregate estimate that you're talking about. But I think in concert with that aggregate estimate, I think if you all would have more serious discussions about the bipartisan Reg Improvement Commission notion, because the regulatory state is huge. You're talking economic costs. You're talking about the new frontier economy costs, the frontier economy, health and safety. There are all of these categories of it that I think you can break up into smaller pieces when you talk about and try to do an aggregate in each one, and do it in a bipartisan basis, do it slowly, but I think it's going to matter because regulations do have macroeconomic effects, and I think they do have feedback effects and will matter a lot.
Yeah, it is truly important. If a regulatory limit is established, is there a danger of agencies increasing regulations to fill up the cap space? the agency would have no incentive not to regulate if they are already below their regulatory budget numbers. So how do you try to mitigate this natural tendency among bureaucrats to spend or regulate as much as they can? So, Dr. McLaughlin, you want to take that one?
Sure, thank you. It's also an important question, and I think this does tie back to the previous question as well. Who's in charge of doing the retrospective analysis and prospective analysis for estimating costs of new rules, and how much credit do you get for eliminating old rules? Certainly, there are incentive questions to consider and conflicts of interest to consider. I do think we should take advantage of as much information as possible, and by that I mean the agencies often do have information about which rules are most costly, which rules are obsolete. The one key advantage of a regulatory budget approach to retrospective review is it gives those agencies incentive to identify them. Now, whether they identify them in a way that is deceptive is another question entirely. To overcome that part, I think there needs to be an oversight process, an independent reviewer, or even replicator of the analyses. But you start off with where the best information is, and that's at the agencies.
I'll go back to Mr.
Just,
Cruz.
it's really interesting. If you're talking about health and safety agencies and lives saved and things, I had imagined in the written testimony that you could almost imagine in the scholarly literature there arising some metric of a marginal cost of the last life saved at a given agency. So one of the incentives for an agency not to burn their cash up is knowing that if they regulate unwisely, there's a great potential that if Congress is overseeing it very closely, and especially has broken off paperwork and economic from health and safety and can really zero in, they can see that FDA is not doing well compared to OSHA or EPA or something like that. So that's one of the pressures that a potential regulatory budget might have if it's structured right.
Very good. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing. I want to go in a little bit different direction. If we stipulate that there's a space for budgeting, I want to talk about how to get the best bang for our buck. And I'll look at the tale they tell of a congressman going to a NASCAR race in North Carolina, and a car hitting the wall and rolling 3 times, and the congressman saying, you know what, every car in America ought to be built like that. And the announcer said, Congressman, you know that's a $350,000 automobile. There's a cost to that. But today, every car is going to have a 3-point seat belt. Soon every car is going to have a rear view camera. There's no ability to say if I'm out driving on country roads in Oklahoma, I need one set of tools, and if I'm in-town traffic driving in Atlanta, I need a different set of tools. We've tried some of that in some cap-and-trade instances, Knox and SOX, back in the Clean Air Act of 1990. Is there a way to monetize danger, a way to monetize value, so that we're not doing the one-size-fits-all regulatory budget? We're saying the price of carbon is $10 a ton. The price of a life lost for Chevrolet is $150,000 or $1.5 million, and then we're going to let the marketplace and consumers drive that train. And I'll close with this. We've been working on solar ever since a great president from my state, Jimmy Carter, has been pushing that. But now what used to be the largest coal-fired utility in the country is about to be the largest solar utility in the country, because economics are driving it. What we don't talk about in a regulatory budget is how economics are driving consumers as opposed to economics driving regulators. Any thoughts on trying to monetize danger and risk?
Well, there's a large literature on that, and there's certainly some controversy about the best methods of doing it, but there's a very large, robust literature, economic literature on monetizing benefits, and it expands all the time. Now, it's great. I'm a big proponent of letting market forces and consumers drive everything you possibly can, but the first principle is get the price right. And if you're talking about, say, carbon problems, CO2 emission, greenhouse gas, climate change issues, then the first step would have to be a large tax on carbon. And I have not seen a lot of enthusiasm in this institution for a large tax on carbon. If you impose a large tax on carbon, you could eliminate a whole lot of other regulations.
Well, if I knew what the regulatory costs were of the current carbon regulation, and I could do a one-for-one exchange, I might end up in a different place on that conversation. Generally, when we talk about carbon taxes, it's not instead of, it's in addition to the current regulatory infrastructure. Mr. Cruz?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because one thing to always remember too about new technologies and new businesses is when a new product comes on board, like a self-driving car, say, and the risks that are going to be involved there, or the drones and the risks that are going to be involved there. Markets don't just create that new product or service, they also have to develop the disciplinary institutions that go along, the liability insurance, the protections and so forth, the new standards that come about. And a lot of those come from the private sector. They don't have to come from here in Washington. They can. If they come from Washington, all the cars are going to end up looking like my Ford Fusion, which is what's happened now. But just as a for example, the federal government controls the airwaves, so I have a great fear that drones are going to be heavily regulated like a utility. And I hope that's another conversation that I hope you all can stop. But theoretically, you wouldn't want to, but you could pack the sky like a neutron star with drone corridors, okay? And you wouldn't have to have the same property rights rules of flying over Disneyland versus flying over your own house. You'd have different trespass rules. Markets can work all of those out, but I fear because we have an FAA in place, and because we have the regimes and those kinds of regimes in place, pre-regulatory regimes in place, you might even say, that the kinds of things you talk about where you get to the actual good risk management, you end up preempting by having the regulatory standards and the agencies already there to do it. They've already jumped ahead in FCC with net neutrality. The FCC and the FTC and FAA are all looking to regulate communications among driverless cars, for example. But maybe the driverless cars shouldn't communicate. Maybe they should just detect. Maybe there won't even be a driverless car. They may be husks that you snap your phone into. We don't know how the market is developing.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. I'm going to give Dr. McLaughlin the last word.
Thank you.
2 seconds.
I think an important point about this monetization issue in markets is that markets in part work because of competition, and budgets do create some sense of competition both between agencies for showing that they're more effective in accomplishing the goals of Congress, and within agencies for showing that different rules will deliver more benefits at a greater bang for the buck. So even without monetizing, you can look at the effectiveness of rules and have them compete.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. McLaughlin, before we go into the questions of how do you assess the cost of these various regulations, one of the concerns I have are this plethora of consumer regulations that we have. It seems to me that commerce only takes place if two parties mutually agree that the exchange is a benefit to each of them. I give you $1 for a cup of coffee. You're telling me that my dollar is worth more to you than your cup of coffee. I'm telling you your cup of coffee is worth more to me than my dollar. We make that exchange. We both go away richer for it. We both go away with something of greater value than we took into that exchange. Until some third-party busybody sticks his nose into the exchange and says, oh, no, the coffee has to be between 110 and 120 degrees and has to be in a biodegradable container, and it has to include condiments if it's going to be consumed more than 25 feet from the point of sale, on and on. Every one of those regulations diminishes the value of that transaction for one or the other of us until the value is destroyed. It seems to me that in this consumer regulatory environment, the single greatest consumer protection is the word no. No, the price is too high. No, the quality is not good enough. No, you didn't treat me nice, I'm going to go down the street. Isn't the role of the legitimate role of the government fairly limited in those consumer transactions? Obviously, it has a very important role to play to assure that contracts are enforced. It's got an important role to play to assure that representations in that marketplace are factual. In other words, you've got to tell the truth. You've got to keep your promises. But beyond that, does government have any legitimate role, or aren't all of these consumer regulations ultimately anti-consumer?
I think it's important to apply some very simple lessons of economics, like you started with in this, to the idea of regulation. Transactions in a market economy rely on the information that's contained in prices. If the cup of coffee is worth $1 to you, that price that you're willing to pay will signal what its value is to you. The more we add layers of regulation or other interventions from the government onto that price, the less information we can get out of that signal. And so it does diminish the ability of a market to work in the most efficient manner that we all prize here. So it's a very good point, and boiling it down to information and prices is a good way of thinking about it, absolutely.
And does rob one party or the other of their good judgment as what's in their best interests?
Correct. It's going to be it's going to have an obfuscating quality to the transaction. There'll be less transactions that would be occurring because you don't know necessarily what your value is, how the values of the prices are separated from regulatory effect and other effects.
The other overarching concern I have involves the regulatory government itself. You have two hungry brothers, one slice of pie. Mother's rule is one brother slices the pie, the other brother chooses his piece. The ambitions of one check the ambitions of the other. One slices, the other chooses. The American founders recognized that's what they were doing wrong in Europe all of these centuries. The same brother who sliced also got to choose. All the powers of government were in the same hands. So they divided up those powers. One party legislates, that's the Congress. Another party actually carries out those decisions. A third party resolves disputes. My concern with the rise of the regulatory state in the last century is that the powers of government that the founders meticulously separated to protect our freedom have been recombined in the same organs. The agency that writes the rules, enforces the rules, and if you run afoul of them, you get hauled before an administrative law judge answerable to that agency, who often gets to keep, for the agency, the money that's assessed from you as a fine. That seems to turn the entire structure of American constitutional government on its head. What are your thoughts?
So again, I commend the analogy there and sort of the simple approach of thinking about this. It's almost as if instead of having one brother cut the pie and the other one choose, one brother cuts the pie and allocates, and there's never even a second glance of whether one slice is larger than the other.
That's the very foundation of tyranny. That's what the American founders tried to factor out of our government, and these regulatory agencies seem to have factored that back in.
And a big difference between a regulatory budget approach that we're considering here and what exists right now, the approach that's used in OIRA and OMB, is that there is retrospective review of the effectiveness of regulations in a regulatory
But it's
budget.
not that the agencies are making good laws or bad laws, it's they're making laws at all. I have no problems relying on them for their advice, but shouldn't they, instead of sending these rules to the Federal Register for enactment, shouldn't they be sending them to Congress for debate?
That's, I think, a more complicated legal question. I think it's definitely a concern whether the agencies are acting outside of the purview given to them by Congress, whether there is some constitutional issues with that. Certainly something to consider.
All legislative powers
Gentlemen.
herein granted are vested
Gentlemen.
in the Congress of the United
Gentleman's
States.
time has expired. Mr. Johnson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for being with us today. You know, there are clearly trade-offs in every regulatory budget. For example, the Canadian counting method excludes any measure or comparison of size. The requirements do not have a dollar figure associated with them. Conversely, a regulatory budget that measures economic costs could be based on speculative data and thus create an inaccurate baseline. What do you believe is the best way to maximize accuracy and minimize trade-offs when determining how to measure the cost of regulations? In terms of measurements, what trade-offs would you be willing to accept? And that's a question for all three of you. Dr. McLaughlin.
Thank you. It's a good question. I do address this to some length in my written testimony, but the Canadian approach of counting requirements or restrictions and regulations, I think, is one that is going to be consistent, if nothing else. I think you use the term accuracy, but I think what you mean is it going to be consistent from one agency to another in terms of how they make those estimations? Is an outside party going to make the same sort of estimation? As you get to more complicated methods of measuring costs, for sure, there's going to be variation in estimation results, and that's a concern. The trade-off is, if you just count requirements, you're missing things like, are there effects on innovation, on economic growth, on the distribution of effects throughout the economy? That is one of the merits of having something like economic costs considered, but then again, there's a trade-off. You get perhaps less consistency.
Mr. Pierce.
I just come back to first principles again. I really am a big fan of OMB. They do a really good job of this. They've been working at it for 25 years at least now. They work on it every day. They're trying to come up with the very best ways of estimating costs and benefits. I'm not sure you can improve upon what they're doing, and they're looking at trade-offs, they're looking at benefits, they're looking at costs. And the other basic point is, as I understand the Canadian approach, it looked only at costs. That is a bad way of budgeting. You've got to look at benefits as well. And that's the virtue of the regulatory budget we have now and of the agency, the very capable agency that's performing that function, the Office of Management and Budget.
Okay, Mr.
Okay.
Cruz.
Patrick is right about that. You've got to take into account the indirect effects and the spillover effects of regulations. The easiest stuff, as I'd indicated earlier, is the direct gross compliance, the paperwork that you're dealing with and things of that sort. So I think you break the pie up into paperwork, economic costs, social costs, environmental regulatory costs, energy costs, because your estimates may be different in each one. But like Dr. Pierce, I would trust OMB first with taking the first crack at this one, and I would want OMB to perhaps solicit a series of estimates and different estimates and have Congress assess them, because no matter what you do on regulatory cost budgeting, it's still going to have to take place within a framework of congressional accountability, the separation of powers issues that Congressman McClintock brought up, because those matter. Because you're never going to be able to register the costs perfectly, as I'd indicated in my opening statement. It's always going to require you all standing behind and watching and say, okay, I'm okay with FDA saying these medical regulations are costing this. That's fine with me. I'm a little less sure about this financial regulation or this Western lands regulation, and I want Congress to step in. There are ways of doing that, like having the rules come back to Congress for a vote, taking the Congressional Review Act more seriously and doing more resolutions. And in particular, you've also got to pay a lot of attention to the regulatory dark matter. I call it the guidance, the memoranda, the circulars, the notices. It's just a flood of these now. A lot of them are significant, and they'll have to be considered somehow within the rubric of a regulatory budget too. So there are a lot of pieces. That's why I say going incrementally, thinking one in, one out, thinking the easy stuff you can get on economic cost versus the more difficult health and safety, where you're going to have to make the benefit assessments and be in control.
Quickly, I have one more question. Thank you. Do you believe, gentlemen, that CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has the tools to calculate regulatory impacts for legislation being considered by the House and Senate, similar to their physical cost estimates? You got to answer quick, because he's going to cut us off.
I think the tools are out there. CBO could take them and run with them, yes.
I think they could do that, but they'd almost certainly require more staffing and more resources.
I agree with Dr. Pierce. I'd start with OMB, but then as the Article I Reg Budget Act, you transition to CBO if you need more independent from the executive branch.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Norcross, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and my apologies for being late. 3 committees at once is a tough one to get through, but thanks for coming. We've had a number of these hearings, and I appreciate the updates and visions of where we might be. But I keep coming back to the fact that whatever we have in place, it's still a human issue that we have to come to some accommodation together. It seems to me that we're looking at creating rules to make us do something that we have the power to do already. I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Well, so the point relating to, the human cost, human side of all this, the human element, is well taken, and I think that's one of the reasons we're here in the first place. There's an error rate in the regulatory process from human involvement in making regulations. I think, regardless of whether we have some consistent agreement on what a cost is or what benefits should be, perhaps the most important point here is a regulatory budget would resemble an error correction process. It would recognize that humans make mistakes in making rules, go back and look for which ones aren't effective, which ones aren't delivering those benefits to humans that we want, and have some way of correcting them.
You mentioned that you wonder that you already have the tools and you could simply use what you have. The problem is the regulatory state is very big now, and I think there's some bipartisan agreement about that when you talk about issues like privacy, cybersecurity, homeland security, the scanners at TSA, and on down the line. There are a lot of things the federal government does that maybe it should do, maybe it shouldn't do. You have certain tools, but there are 3,000 plus regulations that come out every year, but meanwhile you all are passing a few dozen laws. So the lawmaking power has shifted quite a lot. You have tools like the Congressional Review Act, but there aren't that many resolutions of disapproval that get discussed and voted on. And so the tools aren't being used. I would encourage, I agree, I think Congress should use those tools a lot more. It's not happening, but we still do have the regulatory review function in place, of which the regulatory budget is a close cousin of. And it used to be the case under President Reagan's Executive Order 12291 that required the OMB cost-benefit review. OMB had more primacy in the review there. When the Clinton order replaced that, the primacy was given back to agencies. So agencies don't have to submit their rules to OMB necessarily. A lot of them do, but there's nothing OMB can really do to them if they don't. That came out in testimony yesterday. So there are tools there, but they don't have teeth in them, and I think that's what you need.
Mr. Pierce?
Well, I would like to see more legislative activity, but you're all more familiar with the problems there than I am, but it's pretty obvious that the ability to compromise just seems to have disappeared over the last 10 years or so. And I'd love to help you figure out how to restore that, but I don't know how to do it. I think you folks are in the position to do something about that, and I'd love to see it happen. In terms of the question about humans, I mean, it is important to recognize the costs are borne by humans, the benefits accrue to humans. And that's one of the problems in the estimation process, trying to figure out how do you value human life? How do you value health states of human beings? These are very, very difficult questions, and OMB has come up with answers to them, but they're always going to be controversial, and they're always going to be estimates.
Appreciate your responses, and might have just suggested if we could just come together on some accommodations instead of putting into a regulatory. Imagine if we did that with marriages. You have to do this because you won't get along. In many ways, this is what we're dealing here, is a dysfunctional marriage because we can't get together. So I look forward to getting past November where maybe the people will tell us what to do, and I yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Ginta is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing. Mr. Pierce, when's the last time you think Congress compromised on an issue?
Well, the good news is I have seen some indications of that recently. I just haven't seen it with the frequency that I used to see it.
I mean, I think we compromised last night when we passed Mr. Murphy's bill on mental health, something important to me personally, to I know Mr. Norcross and to his state and mine. I think we compromised on the CARA legislation, which we're about to send to the President's desk. I think part of the dysfunction that does exist in Washington to a certain extent, and I agree with that, is that when there is compromise and solutions, it's infrequently identified and pointed to by either those inside the media or outside the media. So while I do agree there's got to be a lot more work to be done, I would hope that when Congress does work together, it's pointed out by those who spend time either managing it or watching it or talking about it. And that's why I wanted to point that out. Two things on regulatory issues for me. Regulation frustrates me on a number of levels, particularly when I see it impacting competitiveness. I don't necessarily disagree with the notion of identifying what the benefits of a regulation are, but let me give you two examples of what's happening in my state. NOAA is eliminating the fishing industry in the state of New Hampshire by adding regulatory requirements, and one in specific. The monitoring requirements, which are now about $710 a day that the actual boat has to pay. 10 years ago, we had 100 boats, small family boats. Today, we have 10, and by the end of the year, we could have 0. Yeah. So when I try to quantify regulatory decisions, I look at it in terms of how families in a historical industry are losing not just their jobs, but their history. Second example, the EPA, whether it's their interpretation of the Clean Water Act, whether it's interpreting what causes an increase in nitrogen or in eelgrass changes, which in their view in New Hampshire is nitrogen levels, or whether it's issuing MS4 permits, they are focusing through their not legislative power, but their agency-based interpretation of authority to impact from a cost basis hundreds of millions of dollars on small communities. So I try to quantify it in terms of how it's directly impacting the people that I represent. My feeling is that we should have fair and responsible regulation, not partial regulation that excludes essentially the economic impact. And I have asked under this administration agency heads if they consider economic impacts, and the answer has been given no, which I think is a mistake. I think it's okay to consider economic impact. So my question would be for Mr. Cruz. While we can have disagreements ideologically in Congress about the policy direction of different agencies and the regulatory impacts, we can't ignore the true personal impact that some of these decisions have. So how do we, considering CBO, and sometimes I agree with CBO and sometimes I don't, how can we get CBO to fairly quantify the impacts that both Republicans and Democrats in Congress would like to consider, particularly given what I'm seeing in my state and the people that I represent?
Yeah, it's the case that the agencies can do regulatory impact analyses and look at the very kind of thing you talked about. I did that at FDA, as I'd mentioned before. But it's often not done. I'd mentioned in the oral testimony that there were 3,410 rules last year, but of those in the last OMB report, there were just 13 that had a cost-benefit analysis done. There were another 3 that had a cost analysis. Now, sometimes they'll include those local impacts, but often they don't. They can, but often they don't, because a lot of times job impacts aren't taken into account in regulations. Often with EPA regulations, in the extreme, you'll hear that the EPA regulations create jobs because you've broken all these windows, so you're going to have all these compliance jobs. But that's the extreme. But often the employment effects aren't taken into account. It's seen as something, well, it's transitional. The people are going to move somewhere else and do something. If there are 90 less fishing boats, they're going to be doing something else, and so things are going to transfer. I completely disagree with that, and I think the cost should be taken into account.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Gentleman's time has expired. I understand Mr. Stutzman is close at hand here, but I want to follow up on that, because I think that what Mr. Ginta did was put a real face on the consequences of some of this, and I'd like Mr. Cruz and Mr. Pierce and Dr. McLaughlin, if you'd like. Mr. Cruz, you and Mr. Pierce have highlighted what you think is excellent work at OMB. How did they miss this then? How did they miss the consequence of that rule? And that's one question, and I'm going to ask Mr. Yarmouth if he has any other questions as well. But and then the second is there seems to be a significant difference between you, Mr. Pierce, and Mr. Cruz about the expansiveness of OMB's work. Mr. Cruz, you've now said 3 or 4 times that OMB just did cost-benefit analysis on 13 of thousands of regulations. Mr. Pierce, I think you intimated, I may be wrong, but that OMB was doing all this work on all of these regulations. So help me understand how they missed this, and then the discrepancy, or apparent discrepancy between your two comments.
Well, I think OMB needs more resources to do the review because the regulatory state has grown. The regulatory enterprise is a lot larger, and there are fewer of them on a relative basis to do it. Now, a lot of times they won't catch a rule like this if it's a guidance or something of that effect, and often a guidance can have an economically significant impact even if it doesn't meet the strict 100 million definition, which would still going to impact jobs. And so there's no requirement that there be a cost-benefit analysis done there at all. But it still comes around to a matter of supervision, and it's really Congress that ought to be the lawmaker and overseeing what EPA is doing and what these effects are. And when we notice these job effects, that ought to be something that becomes a matter that the legislators take into account. But in order for OMB to catch a lot of this stuff, they would need more folks.
Pierce?
I mean, I certainly agree with Mr. Cruz that OMB needs more staff and more funding to do the job effectively. I don't have enough knowledge of these two particular situations to know how that was skipped, or even if it's wrong. I mean, any fisheries resource regulatory agency should be weighing the kinds of costs you were talking about against the massive costs that result from depletion of any fisheries resource. And I don't know whether they did a good job or a poor job of that, or what OMB's role was in that. I'll give you one piece of, I think, most of you would consider good news. The Supreme Court, all 9 justices last term in Michigan versus EPA said, at least when legislation is ambiguous and permits an agency to consider costs, that an agency must consider the costs of what it does. They don't have the discretion not to unless you, through legislation, have deprived them of that discretion. The Supreme Court was unanimous and clear about that. So an agency doesn't have the discretion not to consider costs unless through legislation you have told them they cannot consider costs.
And I understand that both of you think OMB needs more resources, but reviewing having 13 cost-benefit analyses for over 3,000 rules seems to be not just resources. It seems to be focused. Mr. Pierce, I'm interested in that, and then maybe we can just go right on down, and then you.
Well, independent agency rules are not covered, and I have testified numerous occasions that I think they should be covered.
Right.
But that's up to you folks. Only economically significant rules are covered. I think that's the right call. Frankly, the cost of conducting cost-benefit analysis with respect to an insignificant rule is too high.
Yeah.
It doesn't pass the cost-benefit test.
May I briefly jump in on
Please,
this?
yeah.
So to answer the question, how did they miss it? I think there's 2 things to consider. When Congress delegates activities to the agencies, there's 2 ways of making sure the activities go well, whatever your definition of well may be. One is oversight. OIRA and OMB is part of the oversight process. I agree they're understaffed. They're not able to handle the volume of regulations that are put out. But the other is the incentives part of it. What incentives does the agency itself have to consider a one-size-fits-all approach that could maybe harm some groups in some areas and they don't worry about that, or have a more flexible and market-based approach? The incentive for the agency is to make a rule that gets passed, goes forward, it's safe, it's easy to explain, it's not risky, and doesn't necessarily matter for the agency whether the cost to individual groups here or there are well considered.
Great, that's helpful. Mr. Yarmouth, I'm way out of bounds here, but.
That's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, Mr. Ginta's question made me think of something which certainly relates to this discussion, and that is, in eastern Kentucky, coal mining country, we've seen a decline in coal miner employment, something in the neighborhood of 85% or so over the last 40 years. Now, if you ask certain people, what's the main contributor to that decline in employment and to the essential destruction of a culture in eastern Kentucky and elsewhere in Appalachia, they will say it's Obama's war on coal, EPA regulations, Clean Power Plan, all of those things. If you talk to other people who are experts in the field, they say no. The two biggest contributors to the loss of jobs in coal mining country have been the mechanization of coal mining, which is mountaintop removal. So instead of miners going underground, digging the coal out hand by hand, bulldozers come, they blow the tops off mountains, bulldozers take the coal out. And also the availability of very low-cost natural gas, which has forced, or not forced, but has induced utilities to build newer, modern power plants using natural gas. So my question is, in situations like that, where you have multiple factors, if you're trying to assess the cost of a regulation, if you put it into a regulatory process, do you not risk the politicization of those kind of calculations, which would, I guess, kind of lend credence to leaving it at CBO and OMB, although OMB may have a political motivation as well. But certainly, I mean, again, this is a hot political debate in my state, in West Virginia, and in Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and throughout coal country. So do you think there's a risk of politicization of the process if we went to a regulatory budget process?
I've always had difficulty with, I mean, we talk about politicization in two ways. One is, it's the bedrock of the country. It should be political. And you folks and the president are the politically accountable people. It should be politicized in that sense. The numbers, the process of estimation, should be as devoid of political influence as possible. And I think generally, I know EPA does a good job with that. EPA has been under tremendous pressure ever since President Reagan issued Executive Order 12291 to do that in an objective, responsible way. I think they do it, and then they have the oversight of OMB on top of that to keep them honest. I don't have a problem if you folks said, well, CBO should also have a role in that. If you gave them the kind of resources necessary to perform that role, that'd be good. I do happen to be also an expert on the Clean Power Plan, and I agree with the other experts. The single most important factor is reduced price of natural gas attributable to increased supply of natural gas attributable to the new practice of fracking. EPA has played a role in this, but of course, if you want to do something about mitigating climate change, they have to. Coal-fired generating plants are the single largest source of CO2 emissions, and EPA has no choice if it's going to try to reduce emissions of greenhouse gas, but to try to encourage substitution of low-carbon fuels like natural gas for high-carbon fuels like coal, and eventually carbon-free sources like solar and wind for coal.
You need the agency estimates of costs, whether they're politicized or not, but alas, natural gas is a fossil fuel too, and it's going to be and is facing regulations as well. Mountaintop removal is going to be faced with regulations. So just being concerned about looking at coal regulations, you also got to look at them in those, they're coming in those other areas too. But sometimes an issue rises to the level of Congress needing to step in and make a choice and pass a law, even in the context of a regulatory budget, and a budget might even help you tell more clearly when you need to do that. This could be one of those instances.
Dr. McLaughlin, any final comment?
Yes, so to your point, yes, analysis can be subverted for political means. That's the state of the world right now. That's the state of the world we'll live in going forward with whatever happens. But the question is, what information do you have right now for understanding whether the regulations that are being created are accomplishing the objectives that the legislation was intended to accomplish? Right now, all we have is agency estimates of cost, and perhaps on rare occasions, the OIRA review of that to maybe put a stamp of validation on it. If you add an independent body, it may be you're worried about their independence in the long run, you still get another set of information, you get some competing analyses, and you get to think about, well, this first analysis didn't consider natural gas. If the other one does, that makes a lot of sense. You're better informed as a member of Congress.
Great. Thank you. This has been fascinating discussion, and we appreciate it. I think it's an important area, and clearly the more information we get, the better solution we'll be able to put forward. And I, once again, want to reiterate that I'm interested and keen on working with colleagues to make certain that we come forward with the best solution possible. I want to thank you again for joining us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing, and those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions or any extraneous material for the record may do so within 7 days. This hearing stands adjourned.